Negative space is design oxygen. Without it, your designs will die. Negative space lets things breathe, and it's often the most overlooked aspect in design. A good way to think about negative space, think about airline seats. Volume is luxury and space is premium. You pay more to have a wider seat and to have more legroom, and for those better positions that have more room to move around. It's just better and more premium. So one of the most critical skills to develop nice and clean and well-balanced layouts is gonna be for you to become a master of negative space. So if we remember that everything is a box when it comes to UI, then every box needs its own breathing room. We don't wanna create little tiny coffins for all of our elements to live in. Negative space is the design oxygen that allows our design elements to breathe and to thrive. Back in design school in layout class, our professor was such a big stickler of white space and negative space that we had this joke where we would turn in a white piece of paper that had nothing on it, and she would give us an F and it would say not enough white space. Because that's how important it was for her as she was teaching us that negative space and white space, the terms kind of get used interchangeably. It's just really, really important. You can also think of white space as the equivalent of actual space in architecture and architectural design. There are specific guidelines for how wide a doorway needs to be, or how much space around a kitchen island there needs to be, how far away corner cabinets need to be from other things so things have room to open. And it's very, very functional, even though you can't necessarily see it without occupying that space. But the same way that negative space is good for architectural design and for interiors, it's just as important in just flat screen design. So if you have negative space that is just off, and it's not well balanced, it can really, really hurt a layout and make it feel crammed and tight and just super unbalanced. So if you find yourself struggling with a certain piece of interface and you're designing it and it's just not feeling right, it's very likely that you don't have sufficient negative space. Or maybe something is too big and it's taking up too much space. So it needs to be smaller and has more breathing room in context for the full layout. And as we look at designing negative space into our interface, we have a lot more leeway for vertical negative space than we do for horizontal negative space, because every single app, website in existence, for the most part, you can scroll endlessly and you have room to grow, but the width is often going to have to be, just a little bit. You can't have an endless amount of negative space on your width, but you are going to have a lot more flexibility to space things out vertically and kind of open it up and breathe. Now, as you get onto wider layouts, you do have a lot more room, but it's not going to be as much as your vertical negative space. So just take that into consideration when you're going into like a full layout. All right, so now we're going to dig into some quick examples here. Right here, I want to pull up this usecontrast.com website and just kind of point out some of the negative space in here. So we've got about 70 pixels of negative space there, about 70 pixels there. And these shapes are taking up a lot of room, but these shapes are kind of like an intermediate negative space. They themselves are taking up space, but they're big blocks of color, so they actually can kind of be counted as negative space. So right in here, that's quite a big, large area. Whoops, didn't mean to actually take a picture. About 40 pixels there, a little bit more right here. And just kind of noting all of this area kind of throughout here. Another way to think of negative space is pouring water onto the design. Where would the water flow in your design if that was a possibility? Where would the water flow? And anytime you get like a tight bottleneck, that's usually a problem area. So think of water being able to flow effortlessly throughout your design. That's another way to kind of keep your negative space in check. So if I go to this other tab in Chrome here, I've gone and I've stripped out a lot of the negative space. So I've removed the negative space on the top and the bottom here. I've removed the negative space in here. And just look at the paragraphs and the text in general. So these two paragraphs compared to these two blocks of text, if I switch back and forth, it might be subtle to some people if they haven't had experience looking at well-spaced type, but you can really see a big difference if you remove the breathing room around the titles and the breathing room around this little tag that has the color, hex codes, and the ratio score. There's a big difference in all of that. Even right in here, look at this navigation. I mean, there's a lot of negative space around this, but the negative space in here is not done very well when I've stripped all of it out. But if you look at this version, just giving it, you kind of have this, if you imagine a space here where this imaginary space is hitting the edge on both the left and the right. And then I'm reusing that negative space here and here and here, almost as its own spacing element. So I'm really treating negative space like it's its own thing that you can't quite see in these particular designs. All right, let's take a look at another example. This is Fiberstream dashboard, the billing section. I haven't changed any type size in this design at all, but I've stripped out a ton of negative space. And the type and everything, it looks okay, but the spacing is really bad. And so if I pull up the actual version right beside it, everything on both of these screens in terms of size, type size, and everything remains exactly the same as it is. So this CTA is 14 point bold, this CTA is 14 point bold. This is 32, this is 32. So everything's exactly the same. And I'll have a link to this so you can check this out for yourself if you want. But just look at how much negative space this one has. Nearly 100 pixels of negative space on the top and bottom. And that just gives the title a lot more breathing room. It just gives it the ability to kind of own the page. Now, it's not that you couldn't have something tight up against the title, if it was a different screen, a different context, maybe different information, but you might also have to make that a little bit smaller. You're not going to be able to use a giant 32 point type and not have the negative space to support it. You're probably going to have to go, with something like 18 or 20 to kind of have the ability for it to just breathe. You want that title to take a deep breath. And you want all of your elements to be able to breathe. Look at the space below the balance, in between the line items, the larger call to action. I've given this its own negative space in here. The invoices drop down is a little bit larger. And especially these invoice dates and information, it's just a lot more open. You could imagine water flowing through these pieces. And this could even actually go up a little bit, possibly. You can always endlessly tweak this stuff. But I just want to show the stark difference between something with just really cramped up, tight negative space, and then something with, okay, now we can breathe. This content, I can read it. There's space around it. So you're not doing an injustice by you don't want to fill up everything just to fill it up, because negative space is just as important as the positive space. And this is even true in type design. Typographers and type designers, they pay exquisite attention to their detail and what the negative space inside of their letter forms and around the letter forms is doing. And that's what creates a nice balanced typeface. And the same is true for interface design. We have to pay exquisite attention to detail. Every little piece, we want to know exactly what is what. We know, okay, 20 pixels on the left and right. We want our CTA to be 20 pixels from the side, 20 pixels from the bottom. We want this. We want our checkboxes to be 24 points below the other checkbox. Every little detail of negative space needs to be meticulously crafted and thought of and experimented with. You can't just throw things on the screen and hope they look good. You need to have the system, which is where the implicit grid that we talked about earlier comes into play. But I want to focus this lesson more on the importance of the amount of grid you're using. It's not going to be just 4 pixels, 8 pixels, 12 pixels, and then call it a day. Because if you look at this typeface here, you know, this space right in here, you could say, well, hey, I got 16 pixels of space between these titles. I'm using a 4 pixel grid, should be good to go. Right in between here, I've got, you know, this thing's 32 pixels from the bottom of the dropdown. Hey, I'm good to go. No, it doesn't work like that, because if you zoom out and you just look at it, it just feels too cramped. And especially if you look at this in context, especially if you pull up a phone and you compare it to any other well-spaced app, it's gonna feel very cramped. This is a pretty extreme example, but I just wanna point this out because it's very, very common when you're first starting out, especially, to just get it too cramped and too tight. And I make this mistake all the time. I've been designing for decades plus, and I will still make things too tight. And a lot of times if you find yourself stuck, it's, you know, and you open things up a little bit, it can make a world of difference. Let's take a look at one more example here. I've taken the sendowl.com dashboard. This is the product site that I use for like digital products and things like that. And every time I log in here, I see this navigation. Dashboard, products, programs. For one, the icons are not crisp. They're using some like 1x assets for a Retina screen, and they're always blurry. And that always bothers me, but I'm not gonna talk about that too much right now. So you can see over here on the left, I have redesigned this navigation. But before I dig into that part, I do wanna just point out the fact that there is a decent amount of negative space between these icons. But this horizontal line is actually killing that negative space. So if I make some copies and just kind of hide that line for right now and zoom out. And let me just group these really quickly. All right, so that already to me feels better, because these lines are kind of killing the negative space in there. You know, maybe you could have the divider lines if they weren't so bright. I don't think you even need them. I think you could get away with it completely. Now, the other thing here, these icons, and this doesn't necessarily specifically have to do with negative space only, but these icons are way too big for this text. They're just a little bit too big. So what I did was I grabbed the Feather Icons plugin and I just searched for some and just clicked on here and got some different ones that I thought matched up with those particular things, those dashboard products, programs. And all of these are preset at 24 pixels. It's gonna be a nice size to start with. All right, so if we look at this text field right here, you can see that if I try to see what the measurements are on the top and the bottom, I'm not always gonna get a direct 16 and 16. I could have 16 and 16 right there, but sometimes when you have a thing of text, the descenders will, you know, they take up a little bit more space down there. So every now and then I'll just kind of zoom out and look at the negative space on the top and bottom and see if I need to maybe bump it up or not. And all of these are instances of that particular component, so I can look at everything to see what looks a little bit better. But I'm really paying attention to 24 pixels here, 12 pixels here, 24 pixels there. And then even, you know, how wide do I need to make this so it looks, you know, good? You know, how much negative space is between the logo and some of these navigation items. So it's not only just adding negative space, it's more about negative space combined with the proper sizing of elements, the proper sizing of text, and having that all come together as one cohesive element. So you can't really exclude one and focus on the other. So pay special attention to your negative space and let all of those little decisions be very intentional with how tall of the spacing, how wide the spacing is. Be very, very intentional with how that plays in regards to the type size. And there's not always a direct formula because there's different contexts for different styles. There's different typefaces and they work differently inside of different shapes. So sometimes you got to zoom out and just see, how does it feel? Does it feel too heavy? Does it feel too clunky? And then you can go in and make those little changes after you get a kind of a bird's eye view of everything, and show it to a friend, show it to everyone in the Slack group, and get an idea for, what people think of certain pieces of negative space. Post it to Dribbble and get your work out there and get feedback on it. That's how you're going to get better at realizing what makes things look good and what is considered good design, by getting feedback on your design. All right, with that being said, I'm gonna assign you some homework for this lesson, and we are going to be copying someone's work exactly. We're gonna be ripping someone off completely. And that person is gonna be Ben Klein from Rally Interactive. I've pulled his design from Dribbble and I've kind of put it in this Figma file. Now, Ben and the Rally team, I feel like they are masters of negative space usage and layout. A lot of their designs just have lots of gratuitous negative space, and it can be overdone sometimes, just the idea of too much negative space. But I feel that they really nail it on a lot of their projects. So I'm going to get you to copy either a part or all of this layout, because I feel like this has a lot of things going on and everything is very, very exquisitely placed, and the negative space, the alignment, all of it comes together in a really good, strong way. So this will expose you to some decisions that you might not make on your own. So for example, I went ahead and recreated this sidebar. Now I'm using an open source Google font called Teco or something like that. I'm not 100% sure what font they're using, but this one is a little bit more condensed than what they're using, but it's close enough. So I really just went in here and started typing out, what exists there and making it the same color, trying to make sure it was the same size, do the same thing with the one. And then once I have my text field, I'm looking, okay, they're doing 8 pixels between the comments and the title. Okay, the number 1 here and all the numbers, it looks like they're doing 24 to the right, 24 to the left, and this is kind of centered vertically inside of this element. So if I look, this one is more like 35 and 36. I can shrink the height of the number to make it exactly 36. And another little quick pro tip on these numbers, the number 5 is going to be much wider than the number 1. So if you just type a 1 on a path and then you measure the distance to the left and the right, it's going to be different on a 5 than it is on a 1. So if you know you're going to use a 1-digit number, you can make a fixed text block that has a fixed width. In this case, the width is 16. And that way, the 5 and the 8 and the 9, everything's going to fit in that box. And so you're defining a text box, and that will give you some fixed parameters for the left and the right alignment. Versus if you just did the 1 on the path and you made it 24, as soon as you type a 5, your spacing is going to be a little bit different. So when you put it in a box, though, you just need to make sure that it's center aligned. That way that all of these are going to line up. Now you might need to be a little bit pickier if you're getting into the double digits, but it's just an easy way to kind of line up text and keep some nice even spacing on both the left and the right. So I've just recreated this stuff inside so you can get kind of an idea of what this would look like. I'm going to give you access to this file. So you can either use this as a starting point and get started on maybe designing some of these other pieces. You could use the Feather Icons plugin instead of trying to copy these icons, or you could try to draw these, whatever you want to do. But just take either 1 or 2 of these elements, like the top kind of ticker here or the left sidebar, and just lay it out and try to get the measurements really, really close to what they have done here. And just take mental note. Okay, they're using 24 pixels of spacing here. Oh, okay, I wouldn't have thought to make it that wide. You know, if you look at one of these groups, this is 121 pixels tall. That's a big old block of real estate to give one article, you know, especially if it's a big list. You know, and if you had a list of 100 things, maybe 120 is a little bit too tall. But if you only have 5 and you're just calling out 5, you know, the content that you are presenting, it kind of almost dictates with how you can treat it. You don't want, you know, if it was only 3, it might even be bigger. But because it's 5 and it kind of fits with the same size of the image, you can kind of, you know, you can give it some more space. You know, I'm sure as they're designing this, they're thinking, okay, I want this thing to stick above the top of the picture that much and stick below the picture that much. And so they might have adjusted the box of that, you know, Friends Are Reading module as much as they wanted to above the picture, just so it had a nice balance overall. So if you zoom out and you're like, okay, I got this picture, I want this to be sticking out. What is the math I need to do to make 5 of these fill up that space? So that's another way to look at it, as opposed to looking only at the text and the lines. You know, it's also a matter of zooming out and looking at everything in context. So that's enough example and demoing. I'm gonna let you get busy on recreating part of this or all of this and post your work in Slack. Let's check it out. And don't post this to Dribbble because you're copying someone's work exactly. I would recommend not posting direct copies of work unless you were, you know, changing something or making suggestions. But in this case, I would advise you not to post that because, you know, it could just be kind of weird, and you don't want to post it as it's your own work because it's definitely not. We're just trying to get some ideas for people who have done this before, people who are really, really talented at this particular layout and just learning from the decisions that they made. So get busy, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.